Sometimes the greatest act of courage is standing up to those you call family. Sometimes love means defying everything you were taught to believe. In ancient Norway, when plague and famine struck the village of Bjornholm, the elders demanded a blood sacrifice to appease Odin. They chose Astrid, a young woman with golden hair and gentle hands who had never hurt a soul. As flames licked at her feet and the whole village watched her burn, only one man stepped forward. Rurik Skull-Breaker had been cast out 3 years before, branded as cursed by their own seer. But when he saw innocent blood about to be spilled, in the name of tradition, he made a choice that would change everything. With his battle axe gleaming in the firelight, he declared the gods had taken enough. Then he claimed something no Viking warrior had ever dared claim before. Could one man's love be stronger than an entire village's faith? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frozen fjords of Bjornholm stretched like weathered fingers into the grey waters of the North Sea, where ice crystals formed lace patterns on the shore each morning before the weak sun dissolved them into memory. This was a land that tested men's souls as surely as it tested their bodies, where the aurora borealis danced across winter skies like the spirits of fallen warriors, and where every breath of wind carried whispers of ancient gods who demanded respect through sacrifice. Astrid, Eric's daughter, had awakened that morning to the sound of her mother weeping in the adjoining room of their modest longhouse. The thin walls of timber and mud brick could not contain the grief that had settled over their home like morning frost, permanent, penetrating, and impossible to ignore. Her father, Eric the blacksmith, had been dead for 2 months now. Another, victim of the wasting sickness that had claimed nearly 1/3 of their village since the harvest moon. The fever had taken him slowly, burning away his strength until the man who could bend iron with his bare hands could barely lift a cup of mead to his lips. The plague had come with the trading ships from the southern kingdoms, or so the village elders claimed. Others whispered it was punishment from the gods for some transgression they could not name. The crops had failed that autumn, rotting in the fields despite their careful tending. The fish had fled their nets, leaving them empty and dripping with seawater and dashed hopes. Even the livestock grew thin and sickly, their ribs showing through matted fur as winter tightened its grip on the land. Astrid rose from her sleeping furs and padded barefoot across the cold earthen floor to where her mother, Ingrid, sat spinning wool with mechanical precision. The woman's hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding the spindle, while her mind wandered paths too dark for daylight. Her once golden hair, so similar to her daughter's, had gone grey at the temples over these past terrible months, and lines of worry had etched themselves around her blue eyes like tributaries of sorrow. "The elders are meeting again today," Ingrid said, without looking up from her spinning. Her voice carried the flat tone of someone who had exhausted their capacity for emotion. Bjorn Ironside sent word they require all unmarried women to gather at the Great Hall after the midday meal. A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air ran down Astrid's spine. She had heard the whispers in the market square, seen the way the older women looked at her and the other young maidens, with a mixture of pity and calculation. The village was dying, and desperate people often turned to desperate measures. In times like these, when the gods seemed deaf to prayers and offerings of silver and amber, only blood could speak loudly enough to reach their ears. "Mother," Astrid began, but Ingrid held up one weathered hand to silence her. "Your father was a good man," the older woman said, her fingers never pausing in their work. "He believed in the old ways, but he also believed in protecting those he loved. If he were here now, he would have hidden you in the forest until this madness passed. But he is not here, and I am only one woman against the will of the entire village." Astrid knelt beside her mother's chair, placing her own smooth hands over the work-roughened ones that had guided her through childhood. "What are you saying?" "For The first time that morning, Ingrid looked directly at her daughter. The love in her eyes was fierce and desperate, like that of a she-wolf protecting her cub. "I am saying that sometimes we must trust in fate, and sometimes we must make our own. Today you will go to the Great Hall as summoned, but tonight, no matter what they decide, you will remember that you are Eric the blacksmith's daughter, and we do not surrender easily to any force, mortal or divine." The great hall of Bjornholm stood at the village's heart, like the trunk of some massive tree, its timber walls rising high enough to accommodate the long tables where the community gathered for feasts and ceremonies. Smoke from the central fire pit drifted upward through a hole in the thatched roof, carrying with it the scents of pine resin and the lingering aroma of whatever meager fare the villagers had managed to prepare. Carved into the massive support beams were intricate patterns that told the stories of their ancestors, serpents and ravens, ships and swords, and the endless knots that bound past to present to future. Astrid arrived to find 11 other young women already seated on the long benches, their faces reflecting varying degrees of fear, confusion, and resignation. Some she had known since childhood: Sigrid, whose father kept the village's few remaining goats; Thora, who could weave patterns so intricate they seemed to capture sunlight itself; Helga, whose laughter had once filled the halls during feast; Days, but who now sat silent and pale as fresh snow. At the head of the hall, 5 elders occupied the high seats traditionally reserved for honored guests and important decisions. Bjorn Ironside, the village chieftain, sat in the center, a man whose grey beard reached nearly to his belt and whose scarred hands spoke of decades wielding sword and axe in defense of his people. To his right sat Gunnar the Wise, keeper of the old stories and interpreter of omens. The village seer, Ragnhild, perched on his left like some ancient bird of prey, her rheumy eyes seeing things that existed beyond the realm of ordinary sight. "Young women of Bjornholm," Bjorn began, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You have been called here because our village faces its darkest hour. The gods have turned their faces from us, and our prayers and offerings have gone unanswered. The sickness continues to claim our people, and winter promises to be harder than any we have known." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the assembled women like a shroud. "In the old days, when our ancestors faced such trials, they knew what the gods required. Blood calls to blood, and life demands life. The All-Father's hunger can only be satisfied by the most precious offering we can give. A bride to join him in Valhalla, to speak for our people in the halls of the gods." Astrid felt her heart begin to race, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. Around her, she could sense the other women drawing back, as if physical distance might somehow protect them from the chieftain's words. Ragnhild leaned forward, her voice like the whisper of dead leaves. "The runes have spoken clearly. The gods will accept our offering. But the choice must be made with wisdom. Not any blood will suffice. It must be pure, untouched by man, and willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of all." Willing. The word escaped Astrid's lips before she could stop it, drawing the attention of all 5 elders. Bjorn's weathered face showed a flicker of something that might have been regret. "The gods prefer willing sacrifice, child, but they will accept obedience to the greater good when willingness is beyond reach." Gunnar the Wise spread before him a collection of carved wooden runes, their surfaces worn smooth by countless readings. The patterns seemed to shift and dance in the firelight, ancient symbols that held meanings older than memory. "We will cast the bones and read the signs. The All-Father will guide our choice as he has guided our people since the world was young." One by one, the elder called each woman forward to stand before the runes while he cast them upon the scarred wooden table. Astrid watched as her childhood friends faced their potential doom with varying degrees of dignity. Some wept, others stood stoic as stone, and a few even lifted their chins in defiance of fate itself. When her turn came, Astrid rose on unsteady legs and approached the high table. The runes seemed to glow with their own inner light as Gunnar gathered them in his cupped palms, whispering words in the old tongue that predated even their grandparents' memories. With a fluid motion, he cast the carved pieces across the table's surface, where they scattered and settled in patterns that only he could interpret. The silence stretched long enough for Astrid to hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Finally, Gunnar looked up, his expression grave. "Algiz," he said, pointing to a rune that looked like a tree with upward-reaching branches. "Protection, but also sacrifice." And here, his finger moved to another symbol, Gebo, the gift freely given. The signs are clear. Ragnhild's eyes glittered with a light that seemed almost hungry. The gods have spoken. This one carries the mark of the chosen. Her sacrifice will be accepted, and our people will be saved. The words hit Astrid like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain standing. Around her she could hear the other women exhaling in relief, guilt, and sympathy. She was to be the lamb led to slaughter, the price paid for their collective survival. When? The question came from Thora, whose voice shook with emotion. "At sunset, when the boundary between worlds grows thin," Bjorn replied. "We will prepare the sacred fire on the old stone circle beyond the village walls. The ritual must be completed before the moon reaches its zenith, or the offering will be rejected." As the gathering dispersed, Astrid remained standing before the runes, staring down at the symbols that had sealed her fate. Algiz and Gebo, protection through sacrifice, the gift freely given. In her mind, she could hear her father's voice from years past, telling her the old stories around their own fire. The gods were neither kind nor cruel, he had said. They simply were like the turning of seasons or the rising of the sun. To rage against them was as futile as cursing the wind. But as she finally turned to leave the great hall, Astrid caught sight of a figure watching from the shadows near the entrance. For just a moment, she glimpsed a tall man with dark hair and eyes like storm clouds, his face marked by 3 parallel scars that ran from his left temple to his jaw. He wore the leather and fur of a traveler, and at his side hung a battle axe whose blade caught the firelight like captured lightning. Their eyes met for the briefest instant, and in that moment, Astrid felt something shift in the air around them, a recognition that transcended words or logic. Then the stranger melted back into the shadows, leaving her to wonder if she had imagined him entirely. The hours that followed passed like a fever dream. Her mother prepared her as if for a wedding, braiding her golden hair with ribbons and adorning. Her simple dress with the few pieces of silver jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. The village women came to pay their respects, bringing small gifts and whispered blessings, their faces reflecting the complex mixture of grief and relief that comes with tragedy narrowly avoided. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed prophetic in their intensity, Astrid was led from her home toward the ancient stone circle that crowned the hill overlooking Bjornholm. The monuments had stood there since before anyone could remember. 12 massive stones arranged in a perfect circle around a central altar where countless generations had sought to commune with forces beyond human understanding. The entire village followed in solemn procession, their footsteps crunching through the frost-hardened ground. Children clutched their parents' hands, wide-eyed and silent. Warriors who had faced death in battle looked away, unable to meet the gaze of the young woman walking toward her fate with quiet dignity. At the circle's center, a great pyre had been built from seasoned oak and pine, its wooden framework rising like the skeleton of some ancient beast. Ropes hung from posts, driven deep into the frozen earth, and the sacred fire bowl, that bronze vessel older than memory itself, waited to receive the flames that would carry Astrid's spirit to the realm of the gods. As the first stars appeared, in the darkening sky, Astrid was bound to the central post with leather cords that bit into her wrists. The kindling was lit, and flames began to lick upward through the carefully arranged wood. The heat on her face reminded her of summer afternoons in her father's forge, when she would sit and watch him shape iron into tools and weapons with patient skill. The villagers began to chant in the old tongue, their voices rising and falling like the wind through pine boughs. Ragnhild approached with a torch in her withered hands, ready to complete the ritual that would send their offering to Odin's hall. And that was when the stranger stepped from the darkness beyond the circle, his battle-axe gleaming like a fallen star in the firelight, and everything Astrid thought she knew about her fate began to change. The man who emerged from the darkness moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and measured, despite the urgency that radiated from his massive frame. The firelight revealed the full extent of his presence, easily a head taller than most men in the village, with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of the world and arms marked by the intricate tattoos that told the story of a warrior's life. The 3 scars that ran down the left side of his face seemed to glow in the dancing light, and his dark hair hung loose around his shoulders like a wolf's mane. "Hold," he commanded, his voice carrying across the stone circle with the authority of thunder. The single word stopped the chanting as surely as if he had struck each villager silent with his bare hands. Ragnhild's torch wavered in her grip, the flames casting wild shadows across her ancient features. "Rurik Skull-Breaker," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom, and something that might have been fear. "You were banished from this place. The spirits themselves declared you cursed, touched by Loki's madness. You have no right to interfere with sacred matters." Rurik stepped into the circle proper, his boots crunching on frost-brittle grass. The battle-axe in his right hand was a thing of terrible beauty, its double-bladed head forged from the finest steel and etched with runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the firelight. The weapon's handle was wrapped in leather darkened by years of use, and the pommel bore the carved image of a wolf's head with eyes of polished amber. "Sacred," he spoke the word as if it tasted of ash. "This is not sacred, old woman. This is fear dressed up in ceremony and tradition. You would murder an innocent girl because you lacked the courage to face the truth, that the gods help those who help themselves, not those who cower behind ritual sacrifice." Bjorn Ironside rose from where he had been seated on a wooden stool near the altar, his own hand moving instinctively to the sword at his side. "Rurik, you speak of matters you do not understand. The village is dying. We have lost 30 souls to the plague, and winter promises to claim many more. The runes have spoken clearly. Only blood can purchase our salvation." "The runes," Rurik laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Tell me, Gunnar, did your precious runes predict the merchant ships that brought the plague? Did they warn you that storing grain in the lower storehouse would lead to rot and ruin? Or do they only speak when you need them to justify actions your hearts know are wrong?" Astrid watched this exchange with growing wonder and confusion. The flames had not yet reached high enough to seriously threaten her, but the heat was growing, uncomfortable against her skin. More disturbing was the way the villagers seemed frozen by the stranger's presence, as if his very appearance had shattered some spell that held them bound to their dark purpose. "You know nothing of what we have endured," Gunnar the Wise declared, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. 3 years in exile have made you forget the bonds that tie a man to his people. We do what we must to survive." Rurik's storm-grey eyes swept across the assembled faces, taking in the mixture of fear, doubt, and stubborn determination he found there. When his gaze reached Astrid, she felt something electric pass between them, a recognition that went deeper than mere physical attraction, though she could not deny that the sight of him made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with her current peril. "I have forgotten nothing," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouts. "I remember every face in this circle, I remember fighting beside your sons and fathers when the Danish raiders came 5 summers ago. I remember sharing my bread when the harvest failed 3 winters past. And I remember being cast out like a rabid dog when your seer decided I was touched by darkness. He took another step forward, and several of the villagers moved back instinctively. The battle axe remained loose in his grip, but the threat it represented was unmistakable. But I also remember the oaths we swore as children to protect the innocent, to stand against injustice, to be worthy of the songs that would be sung about us after we joined our ancestors in the halls of the dead. Where is that honor now? Where is the courage that once made Bjornholm a name feared and respected throughout these lands? Ragnhild's eyes glittered with malice as she raised her torch higher. Pretty words from a cursed man. The spirits whispered your doom to me years ago, Rurik Skull-Breaker. They said you were blessed by Loki with skill in battle, but doomed by love to bring ruin to all you hold dear. Do you think it coincidence that you return now, just in time to witness the very sacrifice that might save us all? Perhaps it is. And destiny, Rurik agreed, surprising them all. But not the destiny you imagine. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward with the fluid motion of a striking serpent. The battle axe swept in a wide arc that passed mere inches from Ragnhild's face, the blade biting deep into the wooden post that held Astrid's bonds. The seasoned oak split like kindling, and the leather ropes fell away from her wrists as if cut by invisible knives. Astrid stumbled forward, free but disoriented, her legs weak from fear and the sudden release of tension. Rurik caught her before she could fall, his strong arm encircling her waist as he pulled her against his side. The contact sent warmth flooding through her body, not the threatening heat of the flames, but something altogether more disturbing and wonderful. The gods have taken enough, he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the stone circle. 30 of our people lie in the cold ground, victims of sickness and misfortune. The All-Father's Hall already echoes with the voices of Bjornholm's dead. I say no more. I say this woman belongs to me now, under the old law of claim and protection. The word sent a shock through the assembled villagers like lightning striking the earth. The law Ruric invoked was ancient indeed, older than Christianity, older even than organized worship of the Norse pantheon. It dated back to the earliest days when might made right, and a warrior's word was bond enough to reshape the world. Bjorn's face had gone pale beneath his grey beard. You cannot invoke the old. Law Ruric, you are exile outcast, you have no standing to make such a claim. I am a free man, with sword and axe to back my words, Rurik replied. I have shed blood in defense of this village and its people. My exile was imposed by fear and superstition, not by any crime against the community. By the old law, my claim stands until challenged in single combat. The silence that followed was so complete that Astrid could hear the crackling of the flames and the distant sound of wind through the pine trees that surrounded the hill. She found herself caught between terror and something that felt remarkably like hope. This stranger, this legendary warrior whose very name carried weight throughout the northern lands, had risked everything to save her life. But what did his protection mean? What price would such salvation demand? Gunnar the Wise stepped forward, his expression troubled. The old law has not been invoked in living memory. Its provisions are complex, its requirements stringent. Are you prepared to fulfill all that such a claim demands? Rurik's arm tightened protectively around Astrid's waist. I am prepared to do whatever honor requires. Then you understand that claiming a woman under the old law makes you responsible for her safety, her welfare, and her future. You bind yourself to her as surely as she becomes bound to you. There can be no abandonment, no change of heart, when convenience suggests a different path. I understand. Ragnhild's torch wavered again, and her voice carried the chill of winter winds. You seal your own doom, wolf-child. The spirits showed me your death years ago, consumed by the very flames meant to carry another to the gods. Your defiance changes nothing. The curse upon you will claim its price before the year turns. Rurik met her gaze without flinching. Then let it come. I would rather die standing against injustice than live kneeling to fear. Astrid felt the truth of his words resonate in her bones. Whatever happened next, whatever price they both would pay for this moment of defiance, it was better than the alternative. Better to face an uncertain future than to surrender to the certainty of flames and death. As the fire continued to burn behind them, casting their shadows long across the frost-hardened ground, Rurik guided her toward the edge of the stone circle. The villagers parted before them, like water before the prow of a ship, their faces reflecting confusion, anger, and the first stirrings of something that might have been respect. But as they reached the edge of the circle, Astrid heard Ragnhild's voice rising once more in the ancient tongue, weaving words of power and binding that made the very air around them thicken with supernatural dread. The seer was not finished with them yet, and the night was far from over. The old stone shelter where Rurik led Astrid stood hidden in a grove of ancient pines, half a mile from the village proper. It had been built generations ago as a refuge for hunters and travelers, its walls constructed from the same grey granite that formed the sacred circle where her life had nearly ended. Thick moss covered much of the exterior, and icicles hung like crystal teeth from the low eaves, but the structure remained sound after countless winters. Inside, a small fire crackled in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls, decorated with carved symbols that predated even the oldest stories. Rurik had prepared this place during his years of exile, stocking it with preserved foods, warm furs, and the tools necessary for survival in the harsh northern wilderness. It was Spartan but comfortable, a warrior's sanctuary away from the complications of civilization. Astrid sat on a bench covered with wolf pelts, her hands wrapped around a clay cup filled with hot mead that tasted of honey and herbs. The warmth spread through her body, chasing away the chill that had settled in her bones during those terrifying moments bound to the sacrificial post. She watched Rurik as he moved about the shelter with efficient purpose, banking the fire and securing the heavy wooden door against the night and whatever might follow them from the village. "You saved my life," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I do not understand why. You do not know me." Rurik paused in his preparations, his broad back still turned to her. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of old, pain carefully controlled. "I knew your father. Eric the blacksmith was one of the few men in Bjornholm who spoke against my exile. He believed a man should be judged by his actions, not by the visions of seers or the whispers of fearful elders." He turned to face her, and in the firelight she could see the complexity of emotions that played across his scarred features. "When I heard the village was preparing for blood sacrifice, I thought of him. I thought of what he would say if he knew his daughter was chosen to die for the superstitions of frightened people." Astrid felt tears threaten at the mention of her father. Eric had been a man of strong principles and gentle hands, respected throughout the region for both his skill at the forge and his unwavering sense of justice. That this legendary warrior had known and respected him brought unexpected comfort. "Tell me about your exile," she said. "What did you do that was so terrible the entire village turned against you?" Rurik's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might refuse to answer. Then he sank onto the bench across from her, his massive hands clasped between his knees like a penitent seeking absolution. 3 years ago there was a young woman named Freydis," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "She was the daughter of Magnus the trader, promised in marriage to the son of a neighboring chieftain as part of a political alliance. But she loved another, a young warrior named Leif, who had no wealth or connections to offer her family." Astrid leaned forward, sensing the pain that lay beneath his measured words. "Freydis came to me in secret, begging for help. She wanted to flee with her beloved rather than submit to a marriage that would make her little more than a bargaining chip between powerful men. I agreed to help them escape, believing that love should triumph over political convenience. his hands clenched into fists, and she could see the self-recrimination that still haunted him. But Ragnhild had seen something in her visions, or claimed to have seen it. She warned that if Freydis left the village, great calamity would follow. The marriage alliance would fail, trade agreements would crumble, and Bjornholm would face enemies on all sides. What happened? I helped them flee in the night, provided them with supplies and safe passage to the southern kingdoms. For a brief time, it seemed we had succeeded. Then word came that their ship had been caught in a sudden storm. Both were lost, along with 6 other passengers and the crew. Astrid felt her heart ache for the pain she could see etched in every line of his face. The villagers blamed you. Ragnhild declared that I was touched by Loki, that my interference with fate had brought the storm that claimed those innocent lives. She said the trickster god had blessed me with skill in battle, but cursed me to bring ruin to all I tried to protect. The village council voted for exile rather than execution, a mercy I did not deserve. You blame yourself for their deaths. Rurik's storm-grey eyes met hers, and she saw the weight of guilt he carried like armor that could never be removed. Should I not? My arrogance led to their destruction. My belief that I could defy fate and reshape the world according to my own desires brought tragedy to innocent people. The shelter fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind through the pine boughs outside. Astrid studied the man who had risked everything to save her life, seeing now the depth of his inner torment. He was not the fearless hero of legend, but something more complex and human. A man haunted by the consequences of good intentions gone terribly wrong. "And yet you saved me tonight," she observed quietly. "Despite what happened before, despite the risk to yourself, you chose to intervene again. Perhaps that makes me a fool, or perhaps it makes you a man who refuses to let fear dictate his actions." Before Ruric could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps reached them through the thick wooden walls. Both froze, listening as multiple sets of boots crunched through the frost-covered undergrowth outside their refuge. Rurik rose silently, his hand moving to the battle-axe that leaned against the wall near the door. "Rurik Skull-Breaker," a voice called from outside, Bjorn Ironside speaking with the formal cadence reserved for official pronouncements. "By order of the village council, you will surrender the woman and submit to judgment for your crimes against the community." Rurik's grip tightened on his weapon's handle, but he did not immediately reach for the door. Instead, he looked to Astrid with an expression that asked a question he could not voice aloud. Her life was her own to choose now, freed from the bonds of sacrifice, but not yet committed to the protection he had claimed to offer. She could walk out that door, return to the village, and trust that cooler heads might prevail in the morning. Light, Astrid rose from the bench, moving to stand beside him. Her hand touched his arm, feeling the coiled strength beneath the leather and fur of his traveling clothes. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside, she could hear the murmur of voices as the villagers discussed strategy. At least a dozen men had come, perhaps more, enough to overwhelm even a warrior of Rurik's legendary skill if they were determined to take her by force. But she had made her choice, and with it came a strange sense of peace that she had not felt since the moment her name was called in the great hall. "Bjorn!" Rurik called through the door, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "I invoke the right of single combat. Choose your champion, and let the gods decide who speaks truth." The response came after a long pause, heavy with reluctance and the weight of ancient custom. "The council accepts your challenge. At dawn, you will face Gunnar's son Harold in the Circle of Honor. The winner claims the right to determine the woman's fate." Astrid felt ice form in her stomach at the mention of Harold's name. She had known him since childhood, a warrior nearly as large as Rurik himself, with a reputation for brutal efficiency in battle and absolute loyalty to the old ways. If Rurik fell tomorrow, she would face a choice between the sacrificial fire and a life bound to a man who viewed her as little more than a symbol of divine will. The footsteps retreated, leaving them alone once more with the fire and their thoughts. Tomorrow would bring blood and judgment, but tonight they had sanctuary and the uncertain comfort of shared resolve against an uncertain fate. Dawn came slowly to the northern lands, painting the sky in shades of pearl and gold that seemed almost too beautiful for a day destined to end in bloodshed. Astrid woke to find Rurik already awake, sitting cross-legged before the dying embers of their fire as he carefully sharpened his battle-axe with a whetstone worn smooth by years of use. The rhythmic scraping of steel against stone had become a meditation, each stroke bringing the weapon's edge closer to the razor sharpness that might mean the difference between life and death. She watched him work in silence, noting the careful attention he paid to every inch of the blade's surface. This was not mere weapon maintenance, but ritual preparation. The warrior's communion with the tool that would either preserve his life or deliver his death. The axe itself seemed to respond. Through his ministrations, its steel taking on a gleam that was almost supernatural in the pale morning light. "You have doubts," she said quietly, not wanting to break his concentration, but unable to bear the silence any longer. Rurik's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. "Any warrior who enters combat without doubts is a fool. Harold is young, strong, and driven by absolute certainty in his cause. Those are dangerous qualities in an opponent. But you have fought men like him before, many times, but I have also lived long enough to know that skill and experience do not guarantee victory. A single misstep, a moment's hesitation, a stroke of pure fortune, any of these can determine the outcome of a duel." Astrid rose from the warm furs and moved to kneel beside him, her hand covering his own as it gripped the axe handle. "Then why risk it? We could flee, head south to the trading kingdoms, or west across the sea to lands where the reach of Bjornholm's elders cannot touch us." Rurik's storm-grey eyes met hers, and she saw in them the weight of more than simple duty. "Because running would only prove their accusations true. They say I am cursed to bring ruin to those I try to protect. If I flee now, taking you with me, I become exactly what they claim, a man who destroys lives through selfish action. And if you die today, then at least I die trying to prove them wrong." The logic was flawed, and they both knew it. Dead men proved nothing except that steel could cut flesh and bone. But Astrid understood the deeper current that drove him, the need to redeem himself not just in the eyes of his former people, but in his own estimation. The tragedy of Freydis and her lover had scarred him in ways that went deeper than the marks on his face, and only by facing similar circumstances with a different outcome could he hope to heal those wounds. They shared a simple breakfast of dried meat and hard bread, washing it down with water from a leather skin that tasted faintly of the mountain springs where it had been gathered. Outside their shelter they could hear the sounds of the village waking, voices calling across the distance, the lowing of cattle, and the general bustle of a community preparing for an event that would be remembered long after the participants had joined their ancestors in the halls of the dead. As the sun climbed higher, Rurik began the process of donning his battle gear. Astrid watched with fascination as he transformed from a man burdened by doubt into a warrior prepared for war. First came the mail shirt, hundreds of interlocked iron rings that clinked softly as he pulled the garment over his head. The weight of it settled across his shoulders like a familiar burden, and she could see his posture change as muscle memory reasserted itself. Next came the leather braces that protected his forearms, each one reinforced with strips of steel and decorated with carved symbols that told the story of his victories in battle. A broad belt circled his waist, supporting the weight of his weapons and providing anchor points for the various tools and accessories that might mean the difference between victory and defeat. The helmet was a masterwork of the armorer's craft, polished, steel-shaped to deflect blows while providing maximum visibility and freedom of movement. A nasal guard protected the center of his face, and the cheek plates could be adjusted to cover more or less of his features, depending on the nature of the combat he faced. When he settled it on his head, the transformation was complete. He had become Rurik Skull-Breaker, the legendary warrior whose name was spoken with equal measures of fear and respect throughout the northern kingdoms. "There is something I must tell you," Astrid said as he made final adjustments to his gear. "Something about last night that you should know before you face Harold." Rurik paused in his preparations, giving her his full attention. "When Ragnhild was binding the fire spell, after you claimed me under the old law, I felt something. Presence that was not entirely of this world. The seer's words carried power, but there was something else behind them. Something that watches and waits." A shadow passed across Rurik's features. "You think the curse she spoke of is more than mere superstition. I think there are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. The plague, the failed harvests, even the storm that claimed Freydis and her lover. What if these are not random misfortunes, but pieces of a larger pattern?" Rurik considered her words carefully. Throughout his years of exile, he had wondered the same thing. Too many coincidences, too many tragedies that followed in his wake like wolves tracking a wounded deer. But accepting such a possibility meant acknowledging that he might be fighting not just against human opponents, but against fate itself. "If you are right," he said finally, "then this duel becomes more than a simple trial by combat. It becomes a test of whether mortal will can triumph over supernatural design. Are you prepared for such a test?" Rurik lifted his battle axe, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. The weapon had been with him through countless battles, had tasted the blood of enemies from the Danish raiders to the Slavic tribes of the eastern forests. Its steel had been forged in the sacred fires of his grandfather's forge, quenched in water blessed by 3 different gods, and tempered with rituals that predated the conversion of the southern kingdoms to the White Christ. "I am prepared to face whatever stands between us and freedom," he said, "whether that be Harold's sword, Ragnhild's curses, or the will of the gods themselves." Outside, the sound of approaching voices reached them through the shelter's thick walls. The time for doubt and preparation had ended. The sun had reached its zenith, and the circle of honor awaited the clash that would determine not just their individual fates, but the balance between old fears and new hope in the heart of a community struggling to survive the harshest winter. In living memory, Astrid touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the scars that marked him as a survivor of countless battles. "Whatever happens today, know that your choice last night gave me back my life. That gift can never be taken away, regardless of the outcome." Rurik caught her hand in his own, pressing it against his cheek for a moment that stretched like eternity. Then he released her, shouldered his weapons, and stepped out into the bright morning light to face his destiny. The circle of honor lay in a natural hollow between 2 hills, its boundaries marked by standing stones that had witnessed countless duels over the generations. Unlike the sacred circle where sacrifices were made, this place was dedicated to the settling of disputes through strength of arms and purity of purpose. The earth within the stone ring had been stained dark by the blood of warriors who had fought for love, honor, revenge, and justice, all the causes that men deemed worthy of risking their lives to defend. Nearly the entire population of Bjornholm had gathered to witness the combat, their faces reflecting the complex mixture of emotions that such events always inspired. Some came seeking entertainment, drawn by the primal spectacle of 2 skilled warriors testing their mettle against each other. Others attended from duty, fulfilling their obligation as community members to witness the resolution of disputes that affected them all. But most came because they sensed that this duel carried implications far beyond the fate of a single woman, that the outcome might determine the very soul of their village. Harold Gunnarsson stood at the circle's eastern edge, his massive frame encased in mail that gleamed like silver scales in the afternoon sun. At 25, he was 10 years younger than Ruric, with the kind of raw, physical power that came from a lifetime of hard labor and constant training. His shoulders were broad enough to support a yoke of oxen, his arms thick as tree trunks, and his hands large enough to crush a man's skull like an egg. The sword he carried was nearly as tall as a grown woman, its blade etched with runes that promised victory to the righteous and death to the wicked. But it was not Harold's physical presence that made him truly dangerous. It was the absolute certainty that burned in his pale blue eyes. He believed with every fiber of his being that he fought for the gods, that his cause was just, and that divine providence would guide his sword to victory. Such faith could make a warrior nearly unstoppable, lending strength to tired muscles, and speed to failing reflexes when ordinary men would have fallen. Rurik approached from the west, his own gear marking him as a veteran of campaigns that had taken him far from the familiar fjords of his homeland. His mail was darker, its rings bearing the patina of age and hard use. His weapons showed the nicks and scratches that came from real combat rather than practice bouts, and his movements carried the fluid economy of motion that marked a truly experienced fighter. Where Harold radiated the confidence of youth and righteousness, Rurik embodied the deadly patience of a predator who had survived by learning when to strike and when to wait. Astrid watched from among the crowd, her heart hammering against her. Ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight, she had positioned herself where both fighters could see her, understanding instinctively that her presence might serve as inspiration for one and distraction for the other. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Two men prepared to die for principles they believed in, with her life hanging in the balance of their skill and courage. Bjorn Ironside stepped into the center of the circle, his grey beard stirring in the cold wind that had begun to blow down from the mountains. In his hands, he held an iron rod topped with the carved image of Tyr, the one-handed god of justice and honorable combat. The weapon was ancient, passed down through generations of chieftains who had used it to sanctify duels and ensure that the gods bore witness to the proceedings. "Warriors of Bjornholm," the chieftain called, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "We are come here to settle a dispute that words alone cannot resolve. Rurik Skull-Breaker has invoked the old law, claiming protection over the woman Astrid Eriksdottir. Harold Gunnarsson has accepted the challenge, fighting to uphold the will of the community and the wisdom of our elders." He raised the rod higher, its metal surface catching the pale sunlight. "Let all here witness that this combat is undertaken in accordance with the ancient customs. The fighters will battle until one yields, flees the circle, or joins his ancestors in the halls of the dead. The victor's cause shall be deemed just by the gods, and all present shall accept the outcome without question or appeal." Rurik and Harold stepped forward to receive the traditional blessing, each man placing his weapon hand on the rod, while Bjorn spoke the ritual words in the old tongue. The phrases were so ancient that few present could translate them completely, but their meaning resonated in the bones, an appeal to the gods for wisdom, a request for divine guidance, and a promise that the outcome would be accepted as the will of powers greater than mortal understanding. As the formal preparations concluded, Astrid noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. Ragnhild had positioned herself on a small rise that overlooked the circle, her gnarled hands weaving patterns in the air as she muttered words too quiet to be heard. The seer's eyes were closed, but her lips moved constantly, and the very air around her seemed to shimmer with an energy that had nothing to do with the cold wind or the pale winter sun. "She is calling on dark powers," a voice whispered beside Astrid. She turned to find Thora, one of the other young women who had faced the possibility of sacrifice the night before. The girl's face was pale with fear, but her eyes held a determination that reminded Astrid of her own father's unwavering principles. "What kind of powers?" "My grandmother told stories," Thora murmured, never taking her eyes off the seer. about women who could speak to spirits, who could call curses down upon their enemies and blessings upon their friends. Ragnhild has always claimed such abilities, but I have never seen her use them so openly. Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. If supernatural forces were indeed at work in this conflict, then Harald's physical advantages and righteous conviction might not be enough to guarantee victory. Rurik would be fighting not just against a skilled opponent, but against powers that operated by rules no mortal warrior could fully comprehend. The two fighters took their positions at opposite sides of the circle, weapons ready and eyes locked on each other with the intense focus that preceded mortal combat. Harald raised his great sword in a formal salute, the gesture both respectful and intimidating. Rurik responded with a slight nod, his battle-axe held in a relaxed guard that spoke of readiness without aggression. Bjorn stepped back to the circle's edge, raising the rod of Tyr one final time. "Let the gods judge between you. Begin!" The silence that followed was so complete that Astrid could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Neither fighter moved immediately, each studying his opponent and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The wind continued to blow across the hollow, stirring the frost-brown grass and carrying with it the scent of snow that promised a harsh winter for whoever survived to see it. Then Harald roared his battle cry and charged forward like a berserker, possessed by the spirit of the bear, his massive sword sweeping in an arc that would have split Rurik from shoulder to hip if it had connected. But the older warrior was no longer where the blade fell. He had flowed aside like water, his own axe moving in a counterstroke that forced Harald to adjust his attack in mid-swing. The real battle had begun. The clash of steel on steel rang across the circle like a bell tolling doom, the sound echoing off the surrounding hills and sending ravens spiraling up from the pine trees in raucous alarm. Harald's initial charge had been turned aside, but the young warrior recovered with the fluid grace of a man born to combat. His great sword whipped around in a horizontal cut that would have disemboweled a lesser opponent, but Rurik dropped beneath the arc and rolled forward, his axe reaching for Harald's exposed knee. Harald leaped back, his mail ringing as he landed in a defensive crouch, and for the first time his eyes showed something other than absolute confidence. The older warrior moved unlike any opponent he had faced before, not with the straightforward aggression of a berserker or the methodical precision of a trained soldier, but with the flowing adaptability of water finding its way around obstacles. Every attack was met not with force, but with redirection. Every opening exploited not through overwhelming power, but through perfect timing. The crowd watched in fascination as the two fighters circled each other like wolves contesting territory. Harald represented everything they understood about Viking warfare: strength, courage, and unwavering commitment to the attack. His sword work was textbook perfect, each stroke delivered with maximum force and minimal wasted motion. But Rurik fought like a man who had learned his craft in a dozen different lands, against enemies who followed no single school of combat. His techniques blended Norse axe work with Byzantine footwork, Slavic grappling holds, and movements that seemed borrowed from the Eastern warriors who traveled the great trade routes. "He fights like a ghost," someone whispered in the crowd, and Astrid understood what they meant. There was something almost supernatural about the way Rurik seemed to anticipate his opponent's moves, flowing out of danger an instant before Harald's blade arrived to claim the space where he had been standing. It was as if he could see the future written in the younger man's muscles and stance, reading intentions before they became actions. But Harald was learning too. Each exchange taught him something about his opponent's style, and gradually his attacks began to find their mark. His sword opened a shallow cut along Rurik's left arm, drawing first blood to a cheer from the crowd. A few moments later, the pommel of his weapon caught the older warrior a glancing blow to the shoulder that staggered him and sent him retreating toward the circle's edge. Astrid found herself holding her breath as the duel continued. her hands clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms. The outcome seemed to shift with each exchange. First Harold gaining advantage through raw power and reach, then Rurik countering with superior technique and experience. Neither man showed signs of yielding, and both seemed prepared to fight until death claimed the loser. As the battle progressed, something else became apparent to those watching closely. The very air around the circle seemed to thicken with an energy that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the combatants. Ragnhild's muttered incantations had grown louder, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that matched the ebb and flow of the combat itself. The seer's hands wove intricate patterns in the air, and those with eyes to see might have noticed that the shadows around Harold seemed darker and more substantial than they should have been in the pale afternoon light. Rurik sensed it too, the weight of more than human opposition pressing down on him like invisible chains. His movements began to slow slightly, his reactions a heartbeat behind what they should have been. Harold's next attack, a downward cut that should have been easily avoided, caught him across the ribs and sent him stumbling backward with blood seeping through the links of his mail. "The curse," Thora whispered beside Astrid. "She is calling it down upon him even now. I can feel it in the air like the pressure before a thunderstorm." Astrid watched in growing horror as Rurik's legendary skill seemed to desert him. His footwork became clumsy, his timing off by fractions that in combat might as well have been hours. Harold pressed his advantage ruthlessly, his great sword raining down blows that forced the older warrior to give ground step by step toward the circle's boundary. If Rurik was forced outside the stone markers, he would forfeit the duel, and with it any claim to protection under the old law. But then something unexpected happened. As Harold raised his sword for what promised to be the killing blow, Rurik's hand went not to his axe, but to something that hung from his belt, a small leather pouch that Astrid had not noticed before. His fingers closed around whatever object lay within, and suddenly the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on him seemed to lift like morning mist before the sun. The change was immediate and dramatic. Rurik's next movement flowed with all his old grace and power, carrying him inside Harold's guard faster than the younger man could adjust. His axe, wielded now with both hands, swept upward in an arc that caught Harold's sword near the crossguard and sent it spinning away across the circle to land with a clatter against one of the standing stones. Harold staggered backward, momentarily, defenseless, his eyes wide with shock at the sudden reversal of fortune. But instead of pressing his advantage, Rurik stepped back and lowered his weapon. "Yield," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent circle. "You have fought with honor, Harold Gunnarsson. There is no shame in acknowledging defeat when it comes with respect for your courage." The young warrior looked around the circle, at his father's disappointed face, at the elders who had placed their faith in his sword, at the crowd that waited for his decision. His hand moved instinctively toward the long knife at his belt, but something in Rurik's expression stopped him. There was no mockery there, no triumph at having bested a younger opponent. Only the weary compassion of a man who understood the weight of impossible choices. "I yield," Harold said finally, his voice thick with emotions too complex to name. "The gods have spoken through your blade, Rurik Skull-Breaker. The woman is yours by right of conquest." A collective exhale rose from the crowd as the tension that had held them all in its grip finally released. Bjorn Ironside stepped forward to formally declare the outcome, but his words were lost in the wind that had begun to blow stronger from the mountains. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the first fat snowflakes of winter's early arrival began to fall like tears from the grey sky. Ragnhild's voice cut through the general murmur of conversation like a blade through silk, carrying, clearly despite the distance and the wind, "This changes nothing, Wolfchild. The curse upon you runs deeper than any charm or talisman can reach. Before the snow melts, you will understand the true price of defying fate." But Rurik was no longer listening to the seer's threats. His eyes found Astrid across the circle, and in that moment the rest of the world seemed to fade away. He had won more than a duel today. He had earned the right to protect something precious, to stand between innocence and the darkness that sought to claim it. Whether Ragnhild's curse would ultimately claim him remained to be seen, but for now, at least, love had proven stronger than fear. 3 days after the duel, as the first heavy snows of winter began to blanket the village of Bjornholm, a stranger arrived at the gates carrying news that would shatter everything Rurik and Astrid thought they understood about their situation. The man was tall and lean, wrapped in the dark furs of the Eastern kingdoms, with the pale skin and angular features that marked him as one of the Rus traders who plied the great river routes between the Baltic Sea and the Byzantine Empire. He called himself Dmitri, and he sought audience with Rurik Skull-Breaker on a matter of the utmost urgency. When they met in the Great Hall, with Astrid present at Rurik's side and the village elders maintaining a wary distance, the trader's first words cut through the winter air like a blade through ice. "The woman you have fought to protect," Dmitri said without preamble, his accent thick but his Norse clear enough to be understood. "She is not who you believe her to be." Astrid felt the blood drain from her face, though she could not have said why the stranger's words affected her so strongly. Beside her, Rurik's hand moved instinctively to his axe handle, ready for violence if this proved to be some elaborate trap or deception. "Speak plainly," Rurik commanded. "What do you know of Astrid Eriksdottir that we do not?" Dmitri reached into his travel pack and withdrew an object wrapped in silk, a silver pendant in the shape of a tree with roots and branches that seemed to twist and writhe in the firelight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of master smiths from distant lands, and the metal itself seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the flames that lit the hall. "This belonged to your mother," the trader said, offering the pendant to Astrid. "Her true mother, not the woman who raised you in this village." Astrid's hands trembled as she accepted the pendant, and the moment her fingers touched the silver, memories that were not her own began to flood through her mind. She saw a woman with golden hair like her own, but dressed in the rich furs and jewelry of nobility. The woman stood in a great hall far grander than anything in Bjornholm, surrounded by warriors whose armor bore the markings of the royal house of Kiev. "Freydis," she whispered, the name escaping her lips without conscious thought. "My mother's name was Freydis." Dmitri nodded gravely. "Freydis Vladimirivna, daughter of Prince Vladimir of Novgorod, and one of the most powerful Volkovi, what you would call a seer or sorceress in all the eastern lands. She fled her father's court 25 years ago, carrying you in her womb, pursued by enemies who sought to claim your bloodline for their own dark purposes." The revelation hit Rurik like a physical blow. The woman he had tried to save 3 years ago, the tragedy that had led to his exile, and the guilt that haunted his dreams, had not been some merchant's daughter caught between love and duty. She had been a princess of the Rus, and more than that, a wielder of powers that mortal minds could barely comprehend. "The storm that claimed her ship," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was not natural, was it?" "No," Dmitri confirmed. "Her enemies found her at last, and they called upon forces older and darker than the Christian god or your Norse pantheon. But Freydis was prepared for such an attack. In the final moments before the waves claimed her, she cast a spell of protection and concealment that would hide her daughter from those who sought her bloodline." Astrid stared at the pendant in her hands, feeling power thrumming through the silver like a heartbeat. More memories surfaced, flashes of her earliest years before Eric the blacksmith and his wife Ingrid had taken her in. She remembered a woman's voice singing lullabies in a language she had not heard since childhood, and hands that glowed with gentle light as they traced protective symbols in the air above her cradle. "The woman who raised me," she began, struggling to piece together fragments of half-remembered truth. "Ingrid, she was not barren as everyone believed. She was my mother's friend, sworn to protect me if anything happened to her. Dmitri nodded again. Fridas placed you with the blacksmith's family because their simple life would provide perfect camouflage. Who would think to look for a princess among the common folk of a remote village? And Eric was more than he seemed, a former warrior who had served in the royal guard before choosing a quiet life at his forge. The implications began to cascade through Rurik's mind like stones tumbling down a mountainside. If Astrid was truly the daughter of a royal sorceress, then the strange coincidences that had plagued his life took on new meaning. His exile for trying to help Fridas escape had not been the random cruelty of fate. It had been orchestrated to separate him from the woman he was destined to protect. Ragnhild knew, Astrid said suddenly, her voice tight with anger and understanding. She has always known who I really am. The plague, the failed harvests, even my selection for sacrifice. It was all part of some larger plan. Dmitri's expression grew grave. The seer of your village is not what she appears to be. Her true name is Baba Yaga's granddaughter Kostroma, and she has spent decades positioning herself to claim your bloodline when the time was right. The sacrifice to Odin was meant to bind your power to her will, making you a conduit for forces that would give her dominion over life and death itself. Rurik felt ice form in his veins as the full scope of the deception became clear. Then every tragedy that has befallen this village, every death from plague, every crop failure, every misfortune, has been engineered to drive them to desperation. Precisely. She needed the people to willingly offer you as sacrifice, believing they acted from piety rather than coercion. Only through such a willing gift could she break the protective spells your mother placed upon you. Astrid's grip tightened on the pendant until her knuckles went white. But why now? Why wait so long if she has known my identity all these years? Because you had to come of age, and because certain cosmic alignments occur only once in a generation. The winter solstice approaches, when the barrier between worlds grows thin. If Kostroma can complete her ritual before the year turns, she will gain access to powers that could reshape the entire northern world according to her will. The trader reached into his pack again, this time withdrawing a scroll sealed with wax that bore the mark of the Byzantine Empire. I carry more than just revelations, Princess. Your grandfather Vladimir has learned of your location through his own network of spies and seers. He offers sanctuary in Novgorod, protection under the royal guard, and training in the arts your mother mastered before her death. But even as Dmitri spoke of safety and royal protection, Astrid felt her heart pulling in a different direction. She looked at Rurik, seeing in his scarred face and storm-grey eyes the man who had risked everything to save her life, not because of her bloodline or her power, but because he believed saving innocence was worth any price. There is another way, she said quietly, her voice carrying new authority that seemed to resonate from the pendant itself. My mother's power flows in my veins, and now that I know the truth, I can access it. We do not have to run from Kostroma. We can face her. Rurik's expression showed both pride and terror at her words. You speak of facing a sorceress who has had decades to plan and prepare, who commands powers that mortal weapons cannot touch. But I am not mortal, Astrid replied, and as she spoke the pendant began to glow brighter. I am Fridas Vladimirivna's daughter, heir to bloodlines that stretch back to the dawn of magic itself. And I have something Kostroma does not, the love of a warrior who has already proven he will stand against gods and fate for my sake. Outside, the wind howled with supernatural fury, and they all knew that their enemy had sensed the revelation that had just unfolded. The final confrontation was coming, and with it would come a test, not just of love and courage, but of power that could remake the world or destroy it entirely. Dmitri's face had gone pale as he sensed the magical forces gathering around them. Princess, if you choose to fight rather than flee, you must understand the stakes. This is not merely about your life or even the fate of this village. The power Kostroma seeks could upset the balance between the old gods and the new, between magic and the mortal world. The very future of the northern kingdoms hangs in the balance. Astrid stood, her posture now reflecting the royal bearing that was her birthright, the pendant blazing like a star against her chest. Then we had better make sure we win. The revelation of Astrid's true identity sent ripples of change through Bjornholm, like stones thrown into still water. Word spread quickly through the village, whispered in doorways, discussed in hushed tones around evening fires, and debated with growing urgency in the halls where the elders gathered. The young woman they had nearly sacrificed to appease their gods was not merely Eric the blacksmith's daughter, but a princess of royal blood, with powers that could reshape the world itself. But with understanding came terror. If Ragnhild Kostroma was indeed the architect of their misfortunes, then every tragedy that had befallen their community over the past months had been orchestrated by a force more malevolent than anything in their darkest nightmares. The Sioux plague that had claimed so many lives, the crop failures that had brought them to the edge of starvation, even the storms that had battered their fishing fleet. All had been weapons in a war they had not even known they were fighting. Rurik spent the hours following Dimitri's revelation in careful preparation, but not for the kind of battle he had fought countless times before. This would not be a conflict that could be won through superior swordsmanship or tactical brilliance. Against a sorceress of Kostroma's power, conventional weapons would be as useless as spitting into a hurricane. Instead, he focused on the one advantage they might possess. The element of surprise that came from her believing her deception remained intact. In the hidden chamber beneath Eric's forge, where the blacksmith had once stored his most precious tools and materials, Rurik and Astrid worked to unlock the secrets of her heritage. The space itself seemed to respond to her presence, revealing compartments and hiding places that had been sealed by magic for over 2 decades. Within these hidden repositories, they found the tools and knowledge that Freydis had left for her daughter, scrolls written in the ancient script of the Rus, vials of oils and powders whose purposes were described in her mother's careful hand, and artifacts whose power hummed with barely contained energy. The most significant discovery was a mirror made from polished obsidian and framed in silver that bore the same intricate tree pattern as Astrid's pendant. When she gazed into its dark surface, she saw not her own reflection, but visions of the past. Her mother's life at the court of Novgorod, the enemies who had pursued her across half the known world, and the spell of concealment that had hidden Astrid's true nature for so many years. She knew this day would come, Astrid murmured, as she watched scenes from her mother's life play out in the mirror's depths. Every precaution, every contingency, she planned for the moment when I would need to reclaim my birthright. Dimitri, who had remained in the village despite the growing danger, served as both guide and teacher in the arts that Astrid was rapidly mastering. His knowledge of the Eastern magical traditions provided context for abilities that manifested with increasing frequency as her true nature asserted itself. When she concentrated, she could feel the life force of every living thing within the village, the warm glow of human souls, the steady pulse of livestock, even the slower rhythms of trees and growing plants. But more disturbing was her growing awareness of the darkness that surrounded Kostroma like a poisonous cloud. The false seer had withdrawn to her hut on the village's outskirts, and from that place emanated waves of malevolent energy that made the very air taste of copper and ash. Whatever ritual she was preparing, it was building toward a crescendo that would coincide with the winter solstice, now only 3 days away. She will not wait much longer, Dimitri warned, as they studied the ancient texts by the light of oil lamps that burned with flames tinged green by the magical oils Astrid had added to them. The cosmic alignment that grants her maximum power occurs at the moment of the solstice's deepest darkness. If she can complete her ritual then, the barriers between worlds will be at their weakest, allowing her to summon forces that have slept since the dawn of creation. Ruric looked up from where he had been examining a collection of weapons that Eric had hidden beneath his tools. Blades forged with techniques that predated the conversion of the southern kingdoms, their steel infused with meteoric iron and quenched in water blessed by forgotten gods. What exactly is she trying to accomplish? You speak of reshaping the world, but to what end? Power, Astrid answered before Dmitri could respond, her voice carrying an authority that came from the knowledge flowing through her awakened bloodline. But not power for its own sake. She seeks to restore the old ways, to bring back the age when magic ruled over mortal concerns and when those who wielded it were revered as gods themselves. The trader nodded grimly. The coming of the White Christ has driven magic from much of the world, forcing practitioners like your mother to hide their abilities or face persecution. Kostroma believes that if she can access sufficient power, she can reverse this tide, eliminate the new religion and restore the ancient pantheons to their former dominance. Using my bloodline as the key, Astrid said, understanding now the full scope of her enemy's ambition. The royal house of Novgorod descends from the first shamans who learned to speak with spirits and bend the elements to their will. My blood carries the genetic memory of those earliest magic users, making me a perfect conduit for powers that most modern practitioners can only dream of accessing. As they spoke, a new presence made itself known in the chamber, a figure materializing from shadows that seemed too deep for the lamplight to penetrate. But this was not an enemy manifestation. Instead, a woman appeared, whose features bore a striking resemblance to Astrid's own, though her form seemed translucent and insubstantial. "Mother," Astrid breathed, recognizing the apparition from the visions she had seen in the obsidian mirror. Freydis smiled, her ghostly features radiant with love and pride. "My daughter, you have grown strong and wise, despite the trials that have been placed before you. But now comes the greatest test of all, the choice between safety and sacrifice, between the easy path and the one that honor demands." The spirit's gaze moved to Ruric, and her expression grew thoughtful. "You are the one who tried to save me all those years ago. The guilt you carry is misplaced, warrior. My death was always part of the pattern, necessary to ensure that my enemy would believe her victory complete. Only by thinking me dead could Kostroma be lured into revealing her true nature." Rurik felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had carried for 3 long years. "Then the storm was my doing," Freydis confirmed. "I called it myself, choosing death over capture, because I knew that only in seeming defeat could I protect what mattered most. My body died, but my spirit has watched over my daughter through all the years of her hiding." The ghost turned back to Astrid, her expression growing serious. "But now the time for hiding is past. Kostroma has grown overconfident, believing that her deception remains intact. She plans to complete her ritual tomorrow night on the eve of the solstice, when she believes you will be helpless to resist her power." "What must we do?" Astrid asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "You must let her begin the ritual," Freydis said, her words sending chills through all who heard them. "Allow her to believe she has won, that her centuries of planning have finally borne fruit. Only when she has committed herself fully to the working will she be vulnerable to counterattack." Dmitri looked horrified. "Princess, you speak of allowing yourself to be captured, to be used as a focus for the very forces that could destroy everything we seek to protect. The risk is necessary," Astrid finished, "because the alternative is to spend the rest of our lives running, always looking over our shoulders, never knowing when she might strike again. Better to face her now, on ground of our choosing, than to live in fear of her power." Rurik's jaw tightened as he grasped the full implication of what she proposed. "You mean to use yourself as bait? I mean to trust in the bond we have forged, she replied, taking his scarred hands in her own. "You have already proven you will stand against gods and fate for my sake. Now I ask you to trust that the power flowing in my veins, combined with the love that has carried us this far, will be enough to turn Kostroma's own strength against her." Freydis began to fade as the energy required to maintain her manifestation grew too great to sustain. "Remember, my daughter, true power comes not from domination, but from sacrifice, not from taking, but from giving. When the moment comes, you will understand what must be done." As the spirit vanished, leaving them alone, with their fears and preparations, Astrid felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a cloak made of starlight and shadow. Tomorrow night would bring the confrontation that would determine not just their personal fate, but the balance of power between light and darkness in the world itself. The next day passed with agonizing slowness as the three of them made final preparations for what was to come. Weapons were sharpened and blessed, protective charms were crafted and consecrated, and contingency plans were made and discarded as inadequate to the scope of what they faced. As sunset approached on the eve of the winter solstice, bringing with it the longest night of the year, Astrid stood before the obsidian mirror one final time. Her reflection showed a young woman transformed, no longer the frightened girl who had nearly died at the sacrificial fire, but a sorceress princess ready to claim her birthright and use it to protect everything she held dear. Outside, the wind began to howl with supernatural fury, and they all knew that Kostroma had sensed their preparations. The final battle was about to begin, and with it would come a reckoning that would echo through the halls of legend for generations to come. The sacred circle at the hill's crown had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the generations of Bjornholm ancestors who had worshipped there. Where once simple stone markers had defined a place of honest communion with the gods, now twisted symbols carved from blackened wood created a pattern that hurt the eyes too. Look upon directly. The very air within the circle writhed with malevolent energy, and the ground itself seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that belonged to no living thing. Kostroma stood at the circle's center, her disguise as the village seer finally cast aside, to reveal her true nature. Gone was the bent frame and roomy-eyed appearance of old Ragnhild. In its place stood a woman of middle years whose beauty was terrible to behold. Flawless features that seemed carved from pale marble, hair black as a moonless night, and eyes that held the cold fire of stars dying in the void between worlds. Her robes were no longer the simple homespun of a village wise woman, but garments woven from shadow itself, their fabric seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Around her, arranged in a precise pattern that followed geometric principles, older than civilization, lay the tools of her working. Crystals that glowed with inner fire marked the cardinal directions, each one attuned to a different element and humming with barely contained power. Chalices filled with liquids that steamed and bubbled without heat stood ready to receive the offerings that would fuel her ritual. And at the very center, where the sacred fire bowl had once held flames of honest worship, now rested an altar carved from meteoric stone whose surface was stained dark with the blood of previous workings. The villagers of Bjornholm stood in forced attendance around the circle's perimeter, their faces reflecting the glazed compliance that came from minds touched by magical compulsion. They had been summoned by whispered commands that bypassed conscious thought, drawn from their homes by an irresistible urge to witness the culmination of events they did not understand. Among them stood Bjorn Ironside, Gunnar the Wise, and even Harald, all reduced to puppets dancing to the sorceress's will. "Bring her forward," Kostroma commanded, and from the darkness beyond the circle emerged figures that had once been men but were now something else entirely. Their eyes glowed with the same cold fire as their mistresses, and their movements carried the fluid grace of predators that no longer remembered what it meant to be human. These were her servants, warriors and hunters from distant lands who had pledged their souls to her service in exchange for power and immortality. Between them, they dragged Astrid, her hands bound with cords that gleamed silver in the supernatural light. She appeared to struggle against her captors, her face showing the appropriate fear and desperation that the situation demanded. But those who knew her well might have noticed the subtle signs that suggested her capture had been willing, the way her bonds allowed for more movement than they should have, the absence of real marks from a genuine struggle, and the faint glow that emanated from the pendant hidden beneath her simple dress. At last, Kostroma breathed, her voice carrying clearly across the circle despite the howling wind that had begun to tear at the hilltop. After so many years of patience, so many carefully laid plans, the daughter of Friedis Vladimirivna comes to claim her destiny. Astrid lifted her head with defiance that was only partially feigned. You murdered my mother. You destroyed her life and drove her into exile. Why should I cooperate with anything you plan? Kostroma's laughter was like crystal breaking in the cold air. Cooperate? Child, you misunderstand your role in tonight's working. I do not need your cooperation, only your blood, your power, and the genetic memory that flows in your veins. Whether you give these things willingly or I take them by force matters not at all to the outcome. The sorceress began to move around the altar in a pattern that seemed random, but followed ancient principles of thaumaturgic geometry. As she walked, she chanted in languages that predated the written word, her voice weaving harmonies with the wind itself. The crystals around the circle began to pulse brighter, their light casting shifting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Your mother thought herself clever, Kostroma continued as she worked, hiding you among common folk, binding your power with spells of concealment, even staging her own death to throw me off the trail. But she underestimated my patience and my resources. I have had agents watching this village for decades, waiting for the signs that would herald your awakening. Astrid felt the magical energies building around them like pressure before a thunderstorm. But she forced herself to remain calm and wait for the right moment. According to her mother's spirit, Kostroma would be most vulnerable when she had committed fully to the ritual, when all her power was focused on the working and could not be easily redirected to defense. The plague that ravaged your people, the sorceress continued, her movements growing more complex as the ritual intensified. The crop failures that brought them to desperation, the storms that claimed your fishing fleet, all carefully orchestrated to drive this community to the point where they would willingly offer you as sacrifice. Only through their conscious choice could the protective spells your mother placed upon you be broken. The truth of it hit Astrid like a physical blow. Even though she had suspected as much, every tragedy that had befallen Bjornholm over the past year had been engineered to bring about this moment. Every death, every loss, every tear shed in grief, all had been offerings on the altar of Kostroma's ambition. But as the sorceress raised her hands to begin the final phase of the ritual, Astrid felt something unexpected. A presence in the darkness beyond the circle that had nothing to do with magical compulsion or supernatural servitude. Ruric was out there, she knew, along with Dmitri and perhaps others who had managed to resist Kostroma's mental influence. The trap was working both ways, and soon it would be time to discover which of them had planned more carefully for this moment of truth. The moment Kostroma raised the ceremonial blade above Astrid's heart, the hidden pendant beneath her dress blazed to life with the brilliance of a fallen star. The silver tree burst through the fabric of her simple gown, its radiance so intense that several of the enslaved villagers stumbled backward, their magically compelled minds momentarily freed by the shock of its appearance. Impossible! Kostroma hissed, her perfect features twisting with rage and disbelief. The concealment spell should have hidden your power until the moment of sacrifice. Astrid smiled, her bonds falling away as the silver cords revealed themselves to be illusions woven from moonlight and will. They did hide my power until I chose to reveal it. My mother taught me well, even from beyond the veil of death. The princess rose from the altar, power flowing around her like liquid starlight. Her simple village dress transformed, becoming robes that seemed cut from the aurora itself, green and gold and silver that shifted and danced with each movement. The pendant at her throat pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and her golden hair streamed behind her as if blown by winds from other worlds. But Kostroma was no mere hedge witch to be overwhelmed by a display of inherited power. With a gesture that sent lightning crackling between her fingers, she rallied the dark energies she had been gathering and hurled them at her unexpected opponent. The bolt of malevolent force should have reduced Astrid to ash and memory, but instead it struck, an invisible barrier, and scattered harmlessly into the night. "You think your mother's gifts make you my equal?" Kostroma snarled, beginning to weave a more complex working with hands that moved too fast for mortal eyes to follow. "I have been perfecting these arts since before your grandmother drew breath. I have drunk from the wells of power that exist in the spaces between worlds. You are a child playing with forces you cannot comprehend." The air around the sorceress began to darken as she called upon entities from the outer void, things that had never been human and never would be, hungry shadows that fed on the life force of the living. They swirled around her like a cloak of animate darkness, their whispered voices promising pain and despair to any who dared oppose their mistress. But as the supernatural battle intensified, Ruric emerged from the forest surrounding the hilltop, his battle axe gleaming with its own inner light. The weapon had been blessed with oils from Fridas's hidden store, its steel now capable of cutting through more than mere flesh and bone. Behind him came Dimitri, wielding a sword whose blade was inscribed with protective runes in the ancient script of Byzantium. "Now!" Astrid called, and the two warriors charged into the circle just as she unleashed her own power in a blazing torrent of silver fire that sent Kostroma's shadow servants shrieking back into the void from whence they came. The sorceress spun to face this new threat, her hands weaving desperate defenses as Rurik's enchanted axe swept toward her neck. But she was no stranger to combat, and centuries of practice had taught her to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. A barrier of crystallized darkness stopped his blade inches from her throat, while tendrils of shadow lashed out to entangle Dimitri's legs and send him sprawling across the frost-hardened ground. "Did you think to surprise me with such a simple stratagem?" Kostroma laughed, though there was strain in her voice as she fought to maintain control over multiple magical workings at once. "I have been preparing for this confrontation longer than your precious princess has been alive." But her confidence wavered as she felt the true scope of the forces arrayed against her. Astrid's power was not the untrained potential she had expected, but something refined and focused through her mother's ghostly tutelage. The pendant blazed brighter with each passing moment, drawing strength from the love that bound the princess to her chosen protector, and the determination that drove them both to stand against impossible odds. More troubling still was the way. Ruric moved in perfect synchronization with Astrid's magical attacks, as if they shared a connection that went deeper than mere physical coordination. When she created openings in Kostroma's defenses, his blade was there to exploit them. When his assault forced the sorceress to divide her attention, her power struck with surgical precision at the weakest points in the enemy's magical armor. Impossible. Kostroma breathed, her perfect composure finally beginning to crack. "You are mortal. There should be no connection between your soul and hers that could create such unity of purpose." Astrid's voice rang clear above the howling of supernatural winds. "You understand power, Kostroma, but you have never understood love. The bond between us was forged in sacrifice and tempered in trust. It is stronger than any magic you could ever wield." The pendant's light reached a crescendo, and suddenly the corrupted sacred circle began to resonate with its original purpose. The standing stones remembered what they had been before Kostroma's corruption, and they began to glow with the honest light of ancient worship. The twisted symbols she had carved cracked and crumbled, their dark power unable to withstand the restoration of the circle's true nature. For the first time in centuries, genuine fear flickered in the sorceress's eyes, as she realized that her carefully laid plans were unraveling faster than she could adapt to contain them. As the first rays of dawn broke over the hills surrounding Bjornholm, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the supernatural darkness of the night, Kostroma's form began to waver like smoke in the wind. The sorceress, who had manipulated an entire community for decades, who had orchestrated tragedy after tragedy in pursuit of ultimate power, now faced the inevitable consequence of her defeat. "This is not possible," she whispered, her voice growing fainter with each word. "I am eternal. I am power incarnate. I cannot be undone by mere sentiment and wishful thinking." But Astrid stepped forward, the pendant at her throat now glowing with gentle warmth rather than blazing intensity, her expression showing not triumph, but something approaching pity. "You are not eternal, Kostroma. You are simply a woman who forgot what it meant to be human, who traded her soul for power and found the bargain hollow in the end." The sacred circle had been completely restored, its standing stones gleaming with the honest light of centuries of faithful worship. Where Kostroma's corrupted symbols had defaced the ancient markers, now only smooth stone remained, as if the darkness had never touched this place at all. The villagers who had been held in magical thrall blinked and stirred, their minds slowly clearing as the compulsion that had controlled them faded with their tormentor's strength. Rurik lowered his battle axe, its blessed blade no longer gleaming with supernatural fire, but simply good steel, well maintained and properly used. The weapon that had served him through countless battles now rested quietly in his grip, its work complete. Around them, the tools and artifacts of Kostroma's working crumbled to dust, their dark purpose unfulfilled and their power broken by the restoration of the circle's true nature. "What happens now?" Dmitri asked, rising slowly from where he had fallen during the battle. The Rus trader bore cuts and bruises from his encounter with the sorceress's shadow servants, but his eyes held the satisfaction of a man who had seen justice properly served. Astrid looked around the circle at the people of Bjornholm, her adopted community, the men and women who had raised her and cared for her, even when they believed her to be nothing more than a blacksmith's daughter. Their faces showed confusion, shame, and the beginning of understanding as they realized how thoroughly they had been manipulated. "Now we heal," she said simply. "The plague that has ravaged this village was Kostroma's doing, sustained by her power to serve her larger purpose. With her defeat, the sickness will fade and the natural order will reassert itself. The crops will grow again, the fish will return to your nets, and life will resume its proper course." Bjorn Ironside stepped forward, his weathered face showing the weight of authority that suddenly felt heavier than ever before. "Princess," he said, using her true title for the first time, "we have wronged you terribly. We nearly sacrificed you to appease gods who never demanded such a price. How can we make amends for such a grievous error?" "By remembering that fear makes us capable of terrible things," Astrid replied. "By choosing to trust in each other rather than in the whispered promises of those who claim to speak for powers beyond our understanding. By building a community based on love and mutual support rather than desperation and superstition." As the sun climbed higher, warming the frost-covered hilltop with its gentle rays, the true scope of the transformation became apparent. The very air seemed cleaner, free from the oppressive weight that had hung over the village for so many months. Birds that had been absent during the worst of Kostroma's influence began to return, their songs filling the morning with music that spoke of renewal and hope. Ruric moved to stand beside Astrid, his scarred hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of two people who had faced the ultimate test together and emerged stronger for the experience. "Your grandfather's offer still stands," he said quietly. "Sanctuary in Novgorod, training in the full extent of your abilities, a place among the royal court that is yours by right of birth." Astrid smiled, her fingers intertwining with his as she looked out over the village that had been her home for more than 20 years. "And leave all this behind? Leave the people who need healing, who need to remember what it means to be a true community? Leave the man who proved that love is stronger than fate itself?" She turned to face the assembled villagers, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "I am Astrid Freydisdottir, daughter of a princess and granddaughter of a king. But I am also Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of a blacksmith who taught me the value of honest work, and a woman who showed me the meaning of selfless love. Both legacies are part of who I am, and I choose to honor them both by remaining here, by helping this community heal and grow stronger." Dmitri bowed deeply, his expression showing both respect and understanding. "Then I will carry word to Prince Vladimir that his granddaughter has chosen her path, and that it is a choice worthy of the royal blood that flows in her veins." As the trader prepared to depart, carrying with him news that would reshape the political landscape of the Eastern kingdoms, the people of Bjornholm began the slow process of returning to their daily lives. But they were changed now, marked by the experience of nearly losing their souls to fear and superstition, and determined to build something better from the ashes of their mistakes. In the days that followed, as winter gradually gave way to the promise of spring, Rurik and Astrid were wed in a ceremony that blended the ancient customs of the north with rituals drawn from her mother's eastern heritage. The sacred circle, restored to its proper purpose, served as the site of their union, a joining not just of two hearts, but of two traditions, two ways of understanding the world and humanity's place within it. The pendant that had revealed Astrid's true nature now hung quietly at her throat, its power no longer blazing with supernatural fire, but glowing with the steady warmth of love freely given and freely received. Sometimes, in moments of quiet reflection, she could feel her mother's presence in that gentle light, not the desperate ghost who had appeared to guide them through their darkest hour, but the eternal love that connects one generation to the next. And in the years that came after, when traveling bards told the story of the princess who chose love over power, who saved a village by refusing to let fear triumph over hope, the people of Bjornholm would smile and nod, knowing that the greatest treasures are not gold or glory, but the bonds we forge with those who choose to stand beside us when the darkness falls.